I'm here to introduce Douglas Brooks. And Douglas Brooks is a boat builder and writer and researcher, specializing in construction of traditional Japanese boats for museums and private clients, boats of all kinds actually. Since 1990, Doug has been researching traditional Japanese boat building, focusing on the techniques and design secrets of the crafts. He has built boats with 6 elderly boat builders in Japan. With all of them, he's been their sole apprentice. He is going to be building another boat in 5 days in Kyoto. Brooks is the only non-Japanese listed in the Nippon Foundation Survey of Craftsmen capable of building traditional Japanese boats. In 2014, Brooks received the Rare Craft Fellowship Award from the American Craft Council in recognition of his work in Japan. In 2015, he was named an Arts and Action Japan Fellow by the Asian Cultural Council. So without further ado, I introduce Douglas Brooks.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And as I struggle with technology, I have to call up my computer out of the sleep. I want to thank, the genesis of this talk goes back a couple of years when I was invited by the Asian Cultural Council to give a talk to their board. And I met Jeffrey Hofer at that meeting, and it was through some conversations with the staff of the Asian Cultural Council and then the Japan Society that this talk came together. And I'm very grateful to Jeffrey and the Omomuki Foundation, the Asian Cultural Council, and of course the Japan Society for letting me speak tonight. My talk will speak mainly about what it was like to be an apprentice and the learning style of apprenticeship in Japan. And I do want to point out that I will be selling copies of my book at the reception. Also on the table will be my business cards in a boat baler, a traditional boat baler. Check that out. But also there's a sign-up sheet there because in August I'll be coming back to New York City and I'll be part of an event where I'll be doing a boat building demo. I'll be demonstrating different craft boat building techniques from Japan. So please put your name and email address, and if you have an interest in that, I'll get in touch with you and make sure you know about it. The organizer of that event should be here. Want to raise their hand if they're here? You are Jan, we've never met, and please seek him out at the reception. I hope you're willing to talk to folks about that event. So without further ado, my talk will move through chronologically my 6 apprenticeships in Japan. If you look at the map, the first apprenticeship was on Sado Island in the Sea of Japan. My second and third apprenticeships were in Tokyo Bay, Tokyo and Urayasu. My 4th apprenticeship was up north in Aomori Prefecture. My 5th apprenticeship was all the way to the south in Okinawa, and actually not shown on this map, my 6th apprenticeship was with the last active boat builder in the tsunami zone, the region that was struck in 2011, and that was in Iwate Prefecture. And so we'll just go through and begin to see those slides in that order. The red lines indicate my major travels in Japan. I've traveled to 45 of Japan's 47 prefectures. I travel around the coastline and the river valleys, specifically seeking out boat builders. And to date, I've met and interviewed about 60 traditional boat builders in Japan. The youngest boat builder I know is 76. And almost none of these men have taught apprentices. As it was pointed out in my introduction, I'm the sole apprentice for all 6 of my teachers. So this is also a discussion about the state of craft in Japan. I was drawn to Sado Island, my first trip to Japan. This is the first photograph I took on Sado. I was drawn by a very odd photograph I saw in a Japanese magazine that showed a woman in a barrel gathering shellfish. And I didn't really believe that these boats could possibly exist. And this is what I found the first harbor that I walked into. These boats, these are called taraibune, which means tub boat. On Sado Island, they're called hangiri. I'll teach you a little bit of Sado dialect. Han means half, and giri means bucket. And so these boats are used to gather seaweed and shellfish. The fisherman here is looking through a wooden box with a glass bottom, and when he sees a catch, he reaches for a selection of spears and plucks things off the bottom. This is actually a very common style of fishing in Japan, to gather things off the bottom of the ocean. These boats are primarily used by women. They were invented in the late 1800s. There's various stories about how they were invented that recall some accident or other that somebody thought of cutting a barrel in half and putting it in the water. But also these boats are traditionally used by women. And this photograph shows a woman, probably old enough to be all of our grandmothers, paddling into port. You notice she's paddling from the bow, if we can talk about bow and stern, with a little oval boat. But when these were invented, the reason women primarily used them is because they allowed a fishing family to have a second boat. So Dad remained using a conventional boat, and this freed up Mom to add to the family's catch. These are still used today in one village, and it seems to be men only put outboard motors on their tugboats. I've never seen a woman operating a motorized tugboat. And so at the time I went to Sado Island in 1990, there was only one active craftsman still building these boats. These are his tools. And after several visits to him, 3 visits to him actually, he invited me to be his apprentice. And he actually spent most of his career, these are miso tubs. These are enormous tubs for fermenting soybean paste. His father and grandfather built these tubs, and he spent about a 35-year career maintaining the braided bamboo hoops that hold these together. And then he retired and began to build tugboats on his own. This is my first teacher, Mr. Koichi Fuji, working in a very traditional setting, sitting on the floor with a block of wood, clamping the work with his feet if necessary, and here he is planing some staves. Now, at the time of my apprenticeship, it was kind of a rude awakening to Japanese apprenticeship. These pictures I took, I'll back up, these pictures I took from a stool because for the first 2.5 days of my apprenticeship, he made me sit and watch him. And so for 8 hours a day, absolutely no words at all traded between us, I would sit and watch him and take photographs. And then at the end of the day, he would jump up, walk out, and before leaving, ask me to clean the shop. And that was it. That were the only words we exchanged. And then 2.5 days into the project, he jumped up, pointed to where he was sitting, and told me to sit there and begin to work. And so I thought, this is my chance. This is what I've been waiting for. And as soon as I sat down, he walked out of the shop. And so, of course, I waited because I was expecting supervision. And in fact, he never returned. And so I started doing what I'd been watching him do, which was plane the staves that form the sides of the boat. And I would kind of look out the door from time to time. But he came back at the very end of the day. My wife told me later that she found him taking a nap. And he came back at the very end of the day, and he went through my pile of work and separated it into 2 piles of acceptable and non-acceptable. And then when he had finished doing that, with no explanation of what made something acceptable versus non-acceptable, he pointed to the non-acceptable pile and said, "Fix them." And he turned and walked away. And that's how the day ended. And so this is the basis for craft learning in Japan. One of the reasons I was so eager to apprentice with Mr. Fuji was that despite my prior interviews with him, he really couldn't talk about what he did. And it became clear to me that the only way I could document this craft was to get inside it as an apprentice. And in particular, the biggest challenge for these particular boats are making the braided bamboo hoops that hold them together. So you cut down 60-foot tall stalks of fresh timber bamboo, you split it 4 ways, then split them again and to get 8 strips. You shape the strips, and then you braid them into hoops. This is classic Japanese barrel making. This is without a doubt the rarest skill I possess. I think there's probably no more than 24 people in Japan that know how to do this. And the only way I know how to do this is because I had the presence of mind during my apprenticeship. I brought a video camera, and my wife videotaped my teacher working, and I came home and sat with pieces of plastic strapping in front of my television and my VCR. I probably have to explain to half the audience what a VCR is. And I easily watched and rewound that tape 100 times. But I got it. I figured it out. And in essence, that is the Japanese apprenticeship. That it is a value-based education in which one of the primary lessons is to develop your powers of observation and concentration and attention to detail. And then in watching your master, whether you're sweeping or sharpening the tools or fetching something from him, always one eye is on the master. Eventually you gain the knowledge. There are tourist tugboats if you go to Sato Island. My teacher was very proud of having built the first glass bottom tugboat. The children are looking through the clear waters. But back to my apprenticeship, my teacher explained to me something interesting, that when he left the cooperage at the miso factory, he apprenticed with the man who was considered the most famous tugboat builder of the 20th century. And he told me something. He used a really interesting phrase, nusumi gekko. Nusumu is the verb to steal, and gekko means lesson or instruction, so stolen lessons. And what he was referring to was the fact that his teacher would not teach him everything. And this is very, very common in Japanese crafts. He was not related to his teacher, and so there was no incentive to necessarily teach the apprentice everything. And Mr. Fuji told me that he used to sneak back into his master's workshop at night with a candle and study his work, particularly the layout of the boats, the measurements, until he finally figured it out. And he even said that he figured out that his teacher had been drawing lines that made no sense. So he had been intentionally trying to fool him. But this is something that's very common if you talk to any Japanese craftsperson and bring up the phrase nusumi gekko, you'll hear some stories. And that is also a part of it. It's considered important that the apprentice show the perseverance and, yes, the guile necessary to steal his or her master's secrets. This is the tugboat that my teacher and I built together. I never saw my teacher again. He died in an accident 3 years after my apprenticeship. And a foundation on the island, because I was his only apprentice, the Kodo Cultural Foundation. Kodo is a very famous taiko band that's based on Sato Island. They approached me and said, what can we do? We don't want to lose this important piece of Sato culture. And so I said that what we needed to do was the traditional thing, and I went back to Sato and taught an apprentice myself. But I said, we're also going to do the non-traditional thing. We're going to do a very Western thing, and that is you're going to publish all of my notes on how to build these boats. So this is my first book. It's actually published in English and Japanese. It forms one of the major chapters of my most recent book, which I'm selling after the talk. And it's nothing more than a how-to book. It's how to build these boats. And I'm very proud of the fact that since this was published, it's now used as a textbook on Sato Island, because every other year the Board of Education has a tugboat building workshop. And since its publication, about 24 people have built themselves tugboats. My drawings, these are the first measured drawings ever published of a tugboat. So this is one of the other issues in Japan that really surprised me, that in going there and meeting these craftsmen, that almost nothing was documented. Almost nothing was written down. Maybe half of Japan's boat builders use no drawings whatsoever. Everything is committed to memory. And then this is the step-by-step of how to braid the bamboo hoops. So you too could join a very tiny fraternity of people. And this is my apprentice and I. We built 2 tugboats together in 2001. And if you ever get up to Vermont, I have one on Lake Champlain. And I don't want to hear rub-a-dub-dub. I've heard that joke too many times. My second apprenticeship was in Urayasu, which is on Tokyo Bay. This is the mouth of the Sakai River, and this was one of the most valuable fisheries in Japan until the 1970s, when pollution destroyed the fisheries, and then developers bought the rights to the fishing grounds and actually filled in the fishing grounds. And if you stood on this bridge today and looked out and took that photograph, what you would see is Magic Mountain at Tokyo Disneyland. It's built on top of what had been one of the most productive fishing spots in Japan. But I was lucky enough to be invited by the Urayasu Folk History Museum, and the man on the left is my second teacher, and he was the last boat builder of Urayasu. And so he and I built one of these little seaweed boats together. These are a pretty iconic boat for that community, to go out and gather nori, or seaweed, off the nets that it's raised on. And he and I were working inside the museum, and this is his boat drawing. And I've encountered this before. It's really quite an irony that though he used drawings, you can't build a boat from that drawing because essential lines are missing. And I don't want to leave the microphone, but you can see the profile of the boat, the top half of the drawing, and the bottom half of the drawing shows you the shape of the bottom of the boat, has a flat bottom. But you notice those 2 top horizontal lines, the top edge of the boat, the sheer, and the middle line, which is called the chine. On the bottom half of the drawing, you do not have what's called the half breadth. You don't know the width of those lines in plan view. So this drawing's incomplete. Practically every Japanese boat drawing I've ever seen is incomplete. And if you ask the boat builder what's going on here, he will say, those are my secrets. Those critical dimensions I commit to memory, and the rest I'm willing to put down on the drawing. And so these are my boat drawings of the same boat. And what I do is I record all of the dimensions that the boat builder uses. So note on the lower half of the drawing, the 2 outer lines to the furthest to the bottom. Notice how they're not on my teacher's drawing. So that's the essential missing information. The little trapezoids below are the shapes of wooden patterns that my teacher made. And they gave us the angle of the stem and the transom and the planking, the bottom plank, at 2 points. And very interesting, my teacher told me we just made those out of scrap wood, and then we could hold them up to the boat and set the angle. And he told me that at the end of each boat, he would burn those patterns. So secrecy was an essential part of the craft. This is that boat under construction. A little bit about boat building. Japanese boat builders work on the floor. There's no workbench. There's no sawhorses to speak of except low blocks. And they don't use clamps. So the boat, all the pieces are held in place by that forest of props. It's a very, I mean, to a Westerner, it's a totally unconventional way to build a boat. My Tokyo teacher, just an interesting tool he used. This is to set an angle. This seems to be universal throughout Japan. That's the stick, has a string with a boat nail hanging on the end of it. That makes it a vertical line, a plumb bob. And so that angle in his mind, he remembers the horizontal distance, which he's measuring, he's looking at, from the string back to that little ink line on the stick. Okay? So that's how every angle is remembered, not as degrees, but as a horizontal measurement. And I can't believe this audience hasn't commented on the baseball cap. I gave this talk 3 weeks ago outside of Boston, and the audience practically cheered when I showed this slide. Actually, the next time I saw him, I gave him a Yankees hat. And in boat building, boat builders in Japan use a unique set of hand saws. You will not find this in any other trade in Japan, a handsaw quite like this, with the back tapered, that curved taper that reaches a point. That's used in a technique called suriawase, because there's no caulking used in Japanese boat building, at least not when boats are new. What's done is, you can see my teacher has 2 pieces of a plank on the floor, and he's very carefully running the saw between the 2 planks. And by doing that, making pass after pass after pass with a progressively finer saw, eventually that edge becomes perfect and fits together with a watertight fit. This is precisely what I'll be doing in a demonstration next August here in New York. You can see the 2 planks on the floor and how they're composed of 3 pieces of wood that get edge nailed together. And so all those seams were fit with a handsaw. And that represents, for 2 of us, to prepare those 2 planks is about 2 full days' work. So it's over and over and over and over again running the saw through the seam. I should point out that one thing that happened for all of my apprenticeships, on the very first day, all 6 of my teachers said the same thing to me. There will be no speaking in the workshop. And this was no different here in Tokyo. And so to us as Westerners, that seems pretty counterintuitive. But again, it was stressed that I had to learn by observation, and not only that, that when I was called upon to do any technique, I was expected to do it perfectly. And if I made a mistake, I was handed the broom. And what I can say, though that style of teaching can seem, to some people, can seem unfair, uncomfortable, it certainly focuses your attention. It does, and I now realize that's part of the point. And so the first lesson in Japanese crafts is humility. One thing my teachers also told me was that none of my previous boat building experience counted, because I had never built their boat, and their boat was the only thing that mattered. So a very high pressure type of learning. These are Japanese boat nails made of flat steel, and you can't use a drill, so you use a special set of chisels. These are very, very rare tools to make a rectangular hole for the nails. And there, my teacher and I are making pilot holes for our nails to edge join the planking. And you cut a mortise, the nail will be coming up through that mortise that's cut in the face of the plank. It'll exit at the edge, the rectangular hole you see, and of course join the plank that's lying tight to that seam. And this is what it looks like in a cutaway. So Japanese boats have very little internal framing. Instead, the planks are quite thick compared to Western boats, and they are edge nailed to each other. And when done properly, the seam between 2 planks is at the apex of the square, running horizontally across the photograph. So when done properly, it is a watertight fit that's almost invisible. Our Tokyo boat coming together, you can see signs of the charring on the inside of the plank. That's from the fire bending. In Asia, planks are bent over an open fire, whereas in Europe and America, we use steam to bend planking. And then this, in the Tokyo project, there was a very interesting moment, a very atypical moment, because one day my teacher asked me to stop and said to me, "I have something to show you." And he took a piece of wood, this piece of wood, and he began to draw lines. He did the freehand sketching on the bottom, and then he took his square and he began to do draw the lines that are in the upper right-hand corner of the plank. And he said, you know, this is a layout technique, and you have to learn this. This is essential to anyone who wants to call themselves a boat builder. You have to know how to do this. It's called nawa no sumi, which means string ink or string layout. And so he drew everything in silence and then looked up at me and said, "So, do you understand that?" And I said, "No." And he made a face, and you can actually see where he planed the lines away, and he drew it a second time. And when he was done, he looked up at me, and he said, "So do you understand it now?" And I said, "No." And he shrugged, and he said, "Okay, back to work." And he never mentioned it again. And this is the next point about learning within the apprentice tradition. And that is, and again, a shock, I think, for Westerners, in that grasping this craft and its subtleties and techniques was entirely my responsibility. And he felt no responsibility whatsoever to teaching me. So in the craft, the teacher does not teach, but the student must learn. And I like to tell my students when I teach, it generally creates a lot of very scared looking faces, but I like to say, I will not save you. Because that's what we've come to expect in Western education, that if I don't get it, the teacher will save me, the teacher will explain it. And this is not the only example of this happening to me in Japan. This is our Tokyo boat at launching. Another thing is that often I would sort of, in my documentarian way, I would not help but want to ask questions. And I was allowed to ask questions, but only at break time and lunchtime. And so while my teacher was smoking a cigarette, I would have a string of questions. And for most of my questions, I would get one of two answers. I'd say, why do you do this, or how do you do that? And my teachers would either say, "Mite wakaru," or "Matte wakaru," which means watch and you will understand, or wait and you will understand. So those are the default answers. This is in Aomori, very different style of boat building in northern Japan, in Tohoku. My teacher used no drawings whatsoever, but he had a few patterns. These are plank angle patterns. Here he is. You notice the first plank, the two planks, bottom planks have been propped against the keel, and he's running the saw through that seam. And notice the props, they're above, they're below, they're to the side. And then he and I working together. He's doing a careful fitting in the stem rabbet while I'm fitting the plank seam along the keel. And in northern Japan and Hokkaido, the boats have framing. You see more of that, which you don't see elsewhere in Japan. Look at the stern. And I was very fortunate that when you go up to Tohoku, you start to see carvings on the fishing boats. And luckily for me, and he was the last active boat builder in Aomori Prefecture, his village had the greatest tradition of carving of any village in the region. And so this is the Chinese peony, the botan, which is really more significant in Buddhism than Shintoism, I believe. All ceremonies around boat building in Japan are Shinto-based. So that was perhaps a funny motif. Other stylized carving, and there's the carved plank placed on the boat. And there's our boat at launching. And right before launching, I went back through my notes, and I calculated that fully 1/6 of the total labor for this boat was spent carving. And I thought, that doesn't make any sense for a fishing boat. I mean, that doesn't make any sense economically for the boat builder who's living on a tight margin. And I asked my teacher about that, and he didn't hesitate. He said, no fisherman would go to sea from this village without those motifs on the boat. And in fact, in that village, modern fiberglass and steel fishing vessels will have carvings, a plank that's carved, fastened to the boat. My 5th apprenticeship in Okinawa, and this is a very, very interesting development to me. This is the only example I've seen in Japan of a real revival in traditional boat building. And it has been created because a traditional fishing boat, the sabani, the Okinawan sabani, has been repurposed by young people as a racing boat. So if you want to save something, turn it into a sport. But this is a really interesting and fascinating story because about 20 years ago, a group of surfers and board sailors decided that the sabani, the traditional fishing boat, which hadn't been used as a sailing vessel in Okinawa in a generation, at least a generation, they decided this would be a cool thing to sail and race. And there were only 3 boat builders left in all of Okinawa that were capable of building them. And I was lucky enough to apprentice with one of them. And when I met him, he was 81 years old. And when I met him, he explained that after World War II, between World War II and about 1960, he built 100 of these boats, all by hand, no power tools whatsoever. And then he switched to fiberglass, and he built fiberglass boats for 30 years. And he said, when these young people came to me and said, will you build us a sabani? He said, my first thought was, do I still remember those dimensions? And so he said he took out 4 sheets of plywood because he built 4 different sizes of sabani, and he sketched them, and he wrote down all the dimensions. And that's the first and only example I've seen in Japan of a boat builder documenting himself. And I immediately tucked those under my arm and ran to the convenience store and laid them down on the copy machine because I wasn't going to lose those. And so he and I built a 26-foot sabani together. And sabanis are what we would call semi-dugouts. So in other words, they were originally, before World War II, they were true dugouts carved out of a single log. But after the war, they developed a style of pinning together large pieces of wood and then carving the hole to get the boat. So those are the 2 side planks. And if you look closely, what you'll see is that at the edges, the outer edges, those planks are full thickness. 2 inches, over 2 inches thick. But in the middle, those planks have been carved out to half their depth. So and then bending them. And then we're building upside down, unique to Okinawa. That's not done elsewhere in Japan. And then a giant timber over 6 inches thick is dropped on it. That's going to form the bottom. And there on the left, you see the bottom has been carved, and it's waiting to flip it over and put it on the sides. Now, one of the reasons I really wanted to study with an Okinawan boat builder was to learn how to do this, because the sabani is put together without any metal fastenings whatsoever. And so, quick lesson in Okinawan boat building. You see the seam between 2 planks, that's running horizontally through the middle of the photograph. I've laid the dovetail key on, spanning the 2 planks. I use a drill to get kind of most of the wood out, and then very carefully chisel that, and please look very closely at the narrowest point of my chiseling. Notice how I left a little bit of material inside the line. Can you see the pencil line? Okay. But then if you follow that cut out to the corners, I cut right out to the pencil line. Now you got to use your imagination here. But when I pound that hardwood key, dovetail key, into that extra material I left acts like 4 wedges, and it pulls those 2 planks together. That can be a bit of a mind imagination thing, but that's how these fastenings work. First, you fit them top and bottom. You want them to be a little loose because you don't want them to hold the planks apart, and then you drive it in. And it is a hardwood, and the planking is soft cedar. And that's the bottom. So the boat is fastened entirely with these wooden dovetail keys. And the Okinawans, this is famous. It's done in a few other places in Japan, but the Okinawans are famous for this. And then inside the boat, so you see the exterior fastenings, and then spaced in between them, they get the same fastening on the inside. And you notice the beautiful sculptural shape of the Sabani. A lot of people liken it to the shape of a fish. These are extraordinarily beautiful boats. These are, I could not do it justice. The most frustrating thing about that project was looking at that boat and how beautiful it was, and then trying to get a photograph to capture it. And I felt I was never successful. And now the bow. And of course those cedar spikes, they obviously get sawn off flush. But I love the double bow tie or fastening there. So the Okinawans, you can't talk about Okinawa without mentioning the war. The island I was on was a particularly brutal battleground. It was the tiny island of Iejima, and my teacher was a teenager. He lost his two older brothers in the battle for Iejima, and that's the mountain that dominates the island. And it was fought over because the Japanese had built an airstrip there, and the Americans wanted an airfield ready to go. These are American fighter planes after the battle, and that large object in the foreground is a drop tank. So that's a gasoline tank, and a fighter plane, if they got in a dogfight, could release it to gain greater maneuverability. That's why they're called drop tanks. So by the thousands, these fell all over Okinawa, and the Okinawans turned them into boats. And you can still find, well, of course you can still find these. They're aluminum. They're a forever boat. And this was in the local museum, but on Iejima, I was actually introduced to a 93-year-old fisherman who was still using his World War II tankubune, tank boat, tankubune. So they even put engines in these, yeah. And this is my teacher's baler. That's carved from a single piece of hard pine. Another sculptural treasure, as far as I'm concerned. And then our launching ceremony, that's my teacher on the right. And Okinawan religion is female-based. There are shamans, all women, and this was not a top-tier shaman, I was told. She was the second level. She was 94 years old. She hadn't made it to the top yet, but she was the only shaman we had on the island, and so she performed our ceremony. And then the annual Sabani race. They race from Zamami Island into the capital city of Naha, which is about a 25-mile open ocean race. And that's, the Okinawa is just a beautiful, beautiful place. And these people who have revived this boat are really, it's really extraordinary what they're doing. I mentioned teaching. These are some of my students at Middlebury College in Middlebury, Vermont. I've been teaching J-term, winter term boat building class called Building the Japanese Boat. And so for 2015 and 2016, we built a series of river boats from both Iwate Prefecture and Kyoto. So my students working on the floor, fitting the planks with the saws, these boats coming together. And then because it's winter in Vermont, we launched them in the college swimming pool. Well, it's about 20 degrees outside. And we do a traditional Shinto ceremony. So here's one of my students pouring sake on the bow of the boat, bow and stern. The Shinto ceremonies around boat building are incredibly colorful. They all have the same basic Shinto motifs, but what's so fun about them is the local traditions that work their way in. And it's fun to talk to boat builders because if I start talking about a ceremony in another community, they invariably say, well, they do it all wrong, you know, because you have to do it the way we do it. I'll ask this audience a question. A boat builder once told me that when you launch a boat in his community, you put it in the water and you spin it to the right, to starboard, 3 times. And I said, why do you do that? And he said, because a funeral only makes left-hand turns. No recognition there. I've never had anybody recognize that. So I'm picturing a hearse always making a left turn to get, I think that's what he meant. So, yeah, I could do a whole book on Shinto boat launching ceremonies. This is my 2016 class. When you've got a bunch of apprentices, you have to kind of gang them up on the work. And my class really, to me, is much less about actually how to put together Japanese boats and much more about the apprentice experience. And so we teach in silence. We try, we can't do it. We can't absolutely do that because none of my students have ever driven a nail with a hammer before my class. Sad but true. You can get into Middlebury College without knowing how to, which is a shame. But we do try to enforce that. And my students' reaction has been overwhelmingly positive. It's sort of fear at the beginning and a kind of recognition of the value of that toward the end. Again, the sense that there are first values you need to develop before you can learn anything. So humility, perseverance, struggle. When my students say they're having a hard time, I tell them that's a good thing. That's part of the lesson. And part of the lesson is overcoming that struggle. And then finally, you know, achieving your goal. My 2016 class, we built a boat from the Agano River in Niigata Prefecture, 27 feet long, and into the pool. So my most recent apprenticeship was, and I have to thank the Asian Cultural Council again because they actually gave me funding for both the Okinawan apprenticeship and this one as well, to which I'm very, very grateful, along with the United States-Japan Foundation, also based here in New York. But I went and studied with the last boat builder in the tsunami zone. I took this photo a few years before the tsunami. What was tragic to me about the disaster, I mean, the loss of life, was the loss of material culture. This coastline had more wooden boats than any place I'd seen in Japan. And they say the tsunami destroyed 90% of all the boats. So this enormous material culture was wiped out in an instant. So I was determined to go back and document how these boats were built. So I worked with Mr. Hiroshi Murakami, very interesting man. Here we are doing some of that fire bending. We're bending the bottom of the boat over an open flame. It's propped under his house. Note how we're bending it, the boulder on the end of the boat, on the end of the plank. And then he's doing his layout. He used no drawings at all. And then at one point while I was there, he walked over to the other side of the shop and put a bevel gauge on the beam and set it and then walked away. And I had been wondering how he was going to derive the bevels for the boat, right? The angle of the keel where the planks meet. There's all kinds of bevels in a boat. And I just luckily was not sweeping or sharpening when he did this, because he walked over there, set the tool, and walked away. And I went over, and all the bevels, all the essential angles for the boat were written on a beam in the shop. But what's more interesting to me is he didn't tell me. And he knew why I was there. And he agreed that I could document his work. But he didn't He never pointed that out. We're both boat builders. We both know that's essential. At the launching, Murakami was a man of very few words, which is good because he had an impenetrable local dialect. But at the launching, he was asked to give a speech, and this is all that he said. He looked at everyone and said, "Mr. Brooks understood 95% of what we did, and I'm not going to tell him what the 5% was that he missed." Now, that's a laugh line in this room, but in fact, in Japan, nobody laughed there. They understood. I mean, culturally, they understood what that meant. So here's that boat coming together. And now it's time to put all of you on the spot, the quiz portion of our presentation. I will not save you unless you're nice. So in the foreground, he's trimming off the ends of the planking at the stern. So first, with his back to me, he sat down and he trimmed that plank end in the foreground that you see. And he didn't do any layout. He didn't measure anything. He just squatted down and sawed that off. And then he went over to the other side of the boat, and I could tell he was aiming at his first cut. And so then he sawed the other one. The question is, how did he get the first angle? Thank you very much for coming. Say that again? He hung a plumb line off the back? No, good. Good, a lot of craftsmen. Actually, my first teacher told me that it was hard to steal his master's secrets because he measured everything with his fingers. And actually, most of my, but that's not correct, sorry. Yes? I see a line on the wall behind him with a red handle. Yeah. So in Murakami's case, the walls of the shop were his drawing. Yeah, he cited on that line. Sorry, that's maybe a little hard to see. But but people get it, so I feel okay, justified. Thank you, very good. And yeah. And our boat coming to completion and on launch day in the harbor. And I'm out there with one of the local fishermen. If you do go to Japan, that region of Japan is still really struggling. It is one of the most beautiful, I won't say beautiful places in Japan, it's one of the most beautiful coastlines on earth. Go up to Iwate. It's a wonderful, wonderful place to go. And I love the people there, and what they've been through is just unimaginable. And I really hope the best for their renewal. Last year, in fact, a year ago as we speak, I was in Kobe, Japan at the Takenaka Carpentry Tools Museum, where I built that same boat in an exhibition. So this is the same Tohoku boat. And one very interesting thing happened. I proposed to the museum that I might teach a series of workshops, Saturday workshops on Japanese boat building during the course of my time there. And they posted it on their Facebook page, and in less than a week, they had filled to capacity. And so here's we're practicing fitting with hand saws. But this is a great thing. I would have never imagined this even 10 years ago. But there is this sudden yearning in Japan to learn boat building, and no doubt many other crafts. And I'm doing what I can to try to further this along and support this. This is the launching of the boat in Kobe Harbor. And moving really toward wrapping up, the Japanese apprenticeship, in a sad, ironic way, sowed the seeds of its own destruction. Interestingly, all of my teachers had sons almost exactly my age, and yet those men, when they came of age, wooden boats were waning in Japan, but the opportunities to move to Tokyo and get a job with Panasonic and leave the fishing village was just exponentially greater than staying with Dad and learning boat building. And you have to ask yourself, who today, what young people today would go through an unpaid 6-year apprenticeship, which was the average boat building apprenticeship in Japan, 6 years. And so as much as I admire the apprentice tradition, I realize that in order to save the craft, something different has to be done. And so my book is an example of that, my articles, my boat drawings, and my teaching. I try to teach as much as I can, and whenever I build a boat in Japan, I try to bring an apprentice on board. But it's still humbling. I talk again about humility. This man is a boat builder. He spent his life building fishing boats, but he also built that inlaid valise and the Bentwood vase that's on the table, and he also built this. This is Naniwa Maru. This is in Osaka, and he is Japan's only traditional shipwright. And he told me that he said that over the nearly 50 years that he built wooden fishing boats, he said his dream, he was always studying, and he wanted to literally relearn the secrets of the Edo era shipwrights, and he has built 4 of these. There's a historic photograph loaded with rice. This is the last boat, and this is 2006, hard to believe, this is 11 years ago. This is Michinoku Maru, right before launching. She was built in 11 months. She's 100 tons, 100 feet long. She was built in 11 months by 15 men, average age 69. And so you see where the craft is going. I believe the average age of both a Japanese fisherman and a Japanese rice farmer currently is 70. View inside the cabin of Michinoku Maru and Michinoku Maru under sail. And then this is my book. This is my 4th book on Japanese boat building. This encompasses my first 5 apprenticeships as well as a chapter on that shipwright. And on Monday, I leave for Japan. I'll be in Gifu working with this man. This is Mr. Seiichi Nasu. He's 85 years old, and he's the only active builder of cormorant fishing boats in Gifu, which Gifu is famous for. And he and I, over the next 9 or 10 weeks, will be building one of these. And I will be documenting his work. He has no drawings, everything's memorized, and these are very unique. He's the first riverboat builder that I will have apprenticed with. And so please, when you go out to the reception, take a business card, check out the boat baler, and keep in touch. Follow my blog. I'll be blogging about the project, and hopefully we'll see a book on how to build these sometime in the future. I'll just conclude by saying thank you. I want to thank all my teachers for their amazing generosity, and I am eternally grateful to them for making me humble. Those who know me know that I need that. Making me humble, making me question my own assumptions about learning, and showing me how to listen for the meaning in the silence. So thank you very much.
I've read a little bit of the book, and one of the things that stood out for me, and it jumped out at me right at the beginning, is the tarabune, the bucket boats. You said there was primarily women doing this fishing. You also said in the book that one of the things that you were supposed to be able to do with the bucket boat is pick it up over your head.
And carry it on your head.
And carry it on your head.
Yeah.
So the boats were made to the size of the person.
Yes, so my teacher told me that the ideal size of a tugboat, that they're oval, they're not round. And he said that the ideal size for a fisherman was a boat's length equaled their span. And there are actually, I've met other boat builders who sized their boats based on the physical dimensions of their customer. And indeed, I have historic photos that show people carrying tugboats on their heads. I own a tugboat. I wouldn't dare try to carry it on my head. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing to even imagine. Later, tugboats were fiberglassed. A company came to Sado Island because the bamboo hoops deteriorate after about 3 or 4 years. And actually, most of my teacher's work was in re-hooping boats. He built 100 tugboats in his career, but he re-hooped boats. So that's a bit of a pain in the arse for the owner. Sorry to use a bad word here at the Japan Society. And so a company seized on that and began to fiberglass boats as a solution. And the sad thing was, you could no longer turn them over. They're too heavy, couldn't carry them. And so they would sit filling with rainwater, and the acceleration of the rot was just phenomenal. And fishermen told me the boats were supposed to last 30 to 40 years, and people would get them fiberglassed, and in 10 years they'd be gone. So a sad dynamic of the modern and the traditional.
One of the other things that I've thought about when I read the book was the number of other sort of accommodations that boat builders make for individual fishermen or individual coves, that the measurements would be different for different places
Right.
this boat was going to launch from.
Right. Actually a competitor of Murakami-san, a man who died right after the tsunami, whom I met. I remember when I met him, he said, I built 3 kinds of fishing boat. And then he had these sticks hanging on his shop wall that contained the secret ratios and things he needed. And there were 19 of them. And I said, why do you have 19 of these? And he said, well, I build 19 kinds of boats. And I said, wait, you told me you built 3 kinds of boats. And he said, oh, yes, I built 3 kinds of boats, but there are slightly different versions for 19 different coves along this coastline. And, what an incredible sensitivity to the environment. And another thing that boat builders did, and this is true in Europe and America and all over the world, I'm sure, and in Japan too, there was a lot of collaboration with the fishermen, because the fishermen would come into the boat shop and tell the boat builder what they needed. And actually, Murakami told me an interesting story. We reached a point nearly to at the finish of our boat together in Tohoku, and he said, in my day, often a boat builder would, I guess your mic failed. He said, often a boat builder would come and take the boat unfinished. And I said, why would he do that? He said, because he would have to go fish to earn the money to pay me to finish it. And really that speaks to what an incredibly tough life in rural Japan post-World War II. The man I mentioned earlier, Iwabuchi-san, who built the 19 variants of a boat, he told me he worked alone his whole life. He told me he built 575 boats. He built about a 20-foot fishing boat with an inboard engine. That's a new boat every 6 weeks for 60 years. And I have to say, for myself, people in Japan say, why do you study with Japanese boat builders? In part, I'm simply in awe of them. I mean, they so put me to shame with the couple dozen boats I've built, in the United States. But just a life of craft that really is impossible to understand. The level of work, the volume of work.
That, to a certain degree, brings me to another question. When you think of craft in Japan and craft in general, there's so many things that we do here in America and around the world. When you document something, there's a lot of scholarly writing. But there's so much in terms of craft that requires you actually spend the time doing it to get it right.
Yeah.
That you just can't document. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and this is, I hope I answer your question as, you express it. But, when I approach Japan, and I just point out, not to blow my own horn, but I've never met anyone else in Japan doing the kind of work I'm doing. Maritime curators in Japan are working in a more scholarly fashion. They're looking at facts and figures and fish prices over time and that sort of thing. But nobody's actually studying the craft alongside the craftsman. And I think in some ways it's a Japanese attitude that I think points to what your question was raising, which is, how do you document somebody like this? How do you possibly record the breadth and depth of what they know? And I guess my Western reaction is, well, if we can't achieve that, we have to do something. I want to revive the craft. I want to save the craft. But there is such an extraordinary level of commitment within the craft that it almost does beg that question, how do you put this down on paper? And I felt this with all my teachers. All my teachers agreed in principle with what I wanted to do. But I don't think any of them really thought that much of it. How do you look at a guy who's built 575 boats and say, I'm going to put what you know between the covers of a book? That's not going to make any sense to him. And I understand that. But it's been part of a kind of push-pull for me throughout all these years in Japan. And I rest my case. I'm doing what I feel I have to do.
Well, so then the next part would be, what do you feel has to be done in order to preserve that tradition? If it can't be written down in a book, if it can't just be documented, you really have to start making boats.
Right.
Traditionally, consistently.
Right, and I think that what Japan needs is a boat building school. And the revival of wooden boat building in North America, Australia, New Zealand, throughout Europe, has all been driven by museums, workshops, schools, etc. Very interesting. I live in the state of Vermont, population 600,000, and we have more furniture-making schools than all of Japan. Population 120 million. And so if you go to Japan and you're interested in a craft, a traditional craft, and you ask Japanese people, so how do I learn how to do this? 99 out of 100 Japanese will say, you have to find a master. That's how you learn how to do this. Whereas what we'll say is, go to YouTube, find a book, get a DVD, take a workshop, find a school. So I like to think that what we did in the West via the Industrial Revolution was that not only did industry sort of destroy the crafts and destroy the apprentice system, except in some specific places like Germany, but we industrialized education. We made it super efficient, and that's where we stand today. Whereas Japan, these things stayed in this rigorous, hidebound, traditional apprenticeship. But I just don't see how, it can't save the craft at this point. And I would like to see a school, and I would like, though, to embody as much as I could, and my Middlebury class is actually a devious experiment on my part, to try to teach and bring in as much of the values of the Japanese apprenticeship that I can. I think that's possible. It's a pretty extraordinary thing to see how students respond to it. I know that.
I think one of the things that also jumped out at me is the lack of language, that all of this is taught silently. So much of my experience in Japan has been one of those things where you look and learn.
Right.
And I feel kind of grateful to a certain degree that my language skills aren't stronger because I can't ask the question. And so did you find in the beginning that was a big part, or is it the regional dialects actually help you from asking those stupid questions that would get you thrown out of the shop?
Yeah, well, none of my teachers were quite willing to throw me out of the shop, though some of them would get pretty stern with me. No, the language thing, when I went for my first apprenticeship, so I interviewed Mr. Fuji on Sato Island with interpreters on 3 occasions. But when I came back for my apprenticeship, I mean, my Japanese at that point was, you know, I could ask where the bus stop was, where the bathroom was, order a meal. And yet the irony was I didn't need language. I could apprentice with him without speaking Japanese. It was great. You know, and I'm not a language learner. Eventually, I did go to the Middlebury College summer language intensive in Japanese, where I was their worst student easily. I'm really not a language whiz. But yeah, that's actually a great comfort to me that there is no speaking. And it shuts me down, and it also teaches me to look. It, trains my eye in ways that I would have never done in any other setting. And I'm very grateful for that. And I'm very grateful for the humility, the lessons learned. I really mean that. I can't stress that enough.
One of the other things that I was thinking about with this talk was the cascades of crafts or other industries that are associated that could die out when something like this does die out.
Right.
Is, you talked in the book again about nail makers,
right.
Saw makers.
Right.
Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so you do find that every craft has associated crafts, the tool makers, the suppliers of fastenings. You know, Okinawa is interesting because the boat builders aren't dependent on a blacksmith. They make their own fastenings. Interestingly, we in the West, and I know we have a lot of people here interested in Japanese woodworking, Westerners have literally saved Japanese tool makers because probably many of you know that Western woodworkers have fallen in love with the Japanese handsaw and the Japanese chisel. And when you travel to the tool-making regions of Japan, it's amazing. I'll be, in a couple of weeks, I'll see this saw maker I know in Kyoto, and he's been flown to France and Denmark to do workshops. And, he actually said to me, kind of jokingly, Europeans appreciate me more than Japanese. But it is a fragile, a fragile ecology, so to speak, that other crafts are dependent. There is only one blacksmith right now in Japan making boat nails. And I'm actually part of a group that's trying to keep him going. So.
One of the other things I noticed in the talk, there wasn't much mention of any sort of finish put on the woods. Is that something that they're left unfinished primarily? Is it something that they're treated with anything? It's just pure wood?
Traditionally, pure wood. And in the old days, I remember my second teacher telling me about this, that you would pull a boat out of the water, you would burn bundles of rice straw, and you would vigorously rub that below the waterline on the boat. And it was a crude attempt to put like a poisonous substance to keep barnacles off the boat. There's actually a famous woodblock print, which is in, I believe is in my book, that shows boat builders doing that. But then later, post-World War II, modern marine paints came in. A lot of Western influence came in. And so you see more painted boats. But my teachers, they said to me, we're building a traditional boat together. We're going to go all the way. We're not going to paint it. And then in Okinawa, that boat had a beautiful finish on it. That was just the soybean oil from my teacher's his wife's soybean oil, tempura oil. Though he said traditionally in Okinawa, you use shark liver oil. And we had a tiny amount of it in the shop, and it stunk to high heaven. It was really, he actually said to me, we could never use this today because the neighbors would complain. But shark liver oil is apparently a very high quality oil. I'll tell you one other interesting story about the intersection of design and modern and traditional. most production small boats and fishing boats in Japan today are built by Yamaha Corporation. They're by far the major boat producer. And until he died last year, I was corresponding with one of Yamaha's most famous naval architects. And he told me a very interesting story. You know, if you know Japan, Japan is a very parochial, kind of localized place. If you're in this village, you know, you don't consort with the people in the next village. And he told me that when Yamaha was trying to break into the fishing boat market, they had him set up regional design studios throughout Japan, because the boats were different all over Japan. Think about that guy building 19 slightly different variations. I mean, the fishermen depended on that. And what Yamaha did was they molded boats based on the local fishing boat. And by doing so, they pulled the customers, because a guy wouldn't take a boat that didn't look like what he was used to. And that they took away the customers, and they did that for about 2 decades, and then they wiped that out and just built a standardized boat for the whole country. But I once found a fiberglass replica dugout made by Yamaha. So Yamaha had copied a boat that had been carved from a single log, and they made it in fiberglass. Beautifully done, with the Yamaha name on the stern.
So on behalf of the audience and the Japan Society, I want to really thank you for coming in and giving this talk.
Thank you.